this video, which will be about configuring various options in the Untangle firewall. Today we're going to look at some options surrounding DHCP, talk a little bit about DNS proxy, and then we'll cover port forwarding and then some other useful statistics you can look at when you're trying to troubleshoot things on an Untangle firewall. Let's start with the DHCP options first. So those are going to be controlled in the config sections. We're going to click on config here at the top. We're going to go to network. Alright, we do have a tab at the top here for DHCP server, but first we're going to look at where DHCP is set up on an interface. So here I've got two interfaces on this Untangle, an internal and an external. That's pretty typical. We're going to click edit on the internal interface. This is the LAN interface. And right here under DHCP configuration, we're going to have an option to turn it on. So if you want the Untangle to do DHCP serving on your network, you need to come here and turn it on. It does come out of the box with this checked to on. So if you don't want the Untangle to be your DHCP server on the network, you need to come here and turn this off. That would be if you have a server on your network that's going to do DHCP for you instead. Here we can give it a range. It starts with 100 to 200. That's a pretty good start. Least duration, this is in seconds. And then if we want to override the gateway on the network, typically you would never want to do that. If you want to change the net mask, again from what it is already on here on this interface, and then give it an override on DNS. So if you have custom DNS servers you want to hand out, the address of an internal AD server, or you want to use OpenDNS like I am here, go ahead and populate this field, and your DHCP clients will get these two DNS servers when they ask for DHCP leases from the Untangle. Down here you can add DHCP options if you need to. For instance, if you have like a TFTP server value to populate for VoIP phones or something of that nature, you could put those in there. You don't often see those used these days. So this is, again, where you're just going to turn on DHCP serving for your LAN interface, or turn it off if you use a different service. Okay, let's go over here now to the DHCP server tab and just see what we can see on this tab. So on this tab, it's going to give us a listing of the current leases with a refresh button there at the top, so we can see what's on our network, what IPs it has, what MAC addresses it has, and then when it got those leases and when they expire. This just shows expiration time, so you'd have to figure out your lease duration from that tab we looked at earlier. Then you can figure out when it obtained the lease. The other really great button here is that there's this little plus button under Add Static. So if you have a printer or something on your network that you want to turn into a static DHCP reservation, it shows up over here, all you have to do is click this plus button to turn this current lease into a static reservation. You can also add static reservations over here by typing in a MAC address, a IP address, and then giving it a description to remind you what that thing is. So pretty nice options here on the Untangle. If you do make changes here in this DHCP server section, don't forget to hit save down here in the bottom. That is always good to do every time we make a change on the Untangle. Okay, so that's a little bit about how to set up DHCP. Another thing that I want to talk about that's very similar, that goes kind of along with that, is the DNS server. By default, the Untangle will proxy DNS, so that means that on your network, if you're using the Untangle as your router, which most times you are, that address, in this case, it would be 192.168.127.1, would also be a DNS proxy, meaning the Untangle will take DNS requests, accept them at this IP address, and then relay them to the internet to be serviced, looked up, and returned results for to your clients. So if you would like to specify the DNS server on the network as the same IP as your router, that would be perfectly acceptable to do. Some routers don't proxy DNS, specifically SonicWall and a few other brands, but the Untangle is one that definitely does proxy DNS, so you can use it in that way. In here, we have the option to add domain DNS servers. So this would be a specific domain and then a server that we wanted to ask for DNS. So this would be a really good thing to use if you want to use the DNS server on the Untangle, but you want it to proxy all DNS requests for your Active Directory domain here. AD domain, domain.local or something of that nature. And then we could give it a server IP address here that we want to proxy all these DNS addresses to. Something like that. Again, anything in green here means I have unsaved changes, and so I need to go down and hit save if I want to lock those in. In this case, I'm not going to. I'm just going to get rid of it. Static DNS entries here would be things that you always want to resolve the same way. So this is an individual record, not a domain name, but an individual record. So this tells the Untangle to always resolve this name to this IP address. That would be useful if you're trying to spoof some internal DNS. Maybe you don't have a DNS server internally, but you want it to be able to always resolve certain records in a certain way. You can use that table there. So quite a bit of power here in the DNS server on the Untangle, which is very handy for the different scenarios you may find in your own network. Let's talk a little bit about port forwarding rules now. We've got a lot of rules tabs up here on the config section inside network. So the port forward rules tab is going to be the first one. And you can see I've just got one example here on this Untangle, but your Untangle might have more of these. So the idea of port forwarding is just that it's going to send specific ports, port 80 in this case, from the internet or the WAN interface to a specific IP that's on the LAN. So this is an example of a very simple rule, one that we give a description to, we enable, we choose a protocol, TCP or UDP typically, and then a port, and then where it goes on the inside. If we switch to advanced here, this is going to give us a little bit more power over this rule. We can choose what kind of protocol, or maybe multiple protocols. We can choose a destination port. And you also see up here we can add conditions. So sometimes the most specific use case we have for this is sometimes we only want to allow traffic from certain places on the internet. So that would be source address. So we're going to say if the source address is 1.1.1.1, then forward port 80 to this internal IP address and keep it port 80 in terms of not doing any port translation, just port 80 to port 80. If I saved this rule, then only traffic that came from 1.1.1.1 would be able to pass to my web server at 192.168.127.105. So this is a good way of locking down certain types of traffic to certain hosts on your network. If you didn't want to do a very lockdown rule, you would remove that. And this basically is anything on the internet can access my server on port 80 by addressing my WAN IP, whether that be via DNS query or just typing in my WAN IP address. So this is just an example of a basic web server in this case, forward, and one that is not using HTTPS because that would be port 443 instead of port 80. We're just going through an example here. Okay, NAT rules. NAT rules translate addresses from one to the other, as well as ports. So in this instance, we can do like an outbound NAT. We might say that my source address is 192.168.27.5. So we'll use that same web server. Give it a name up here. And we want to do a custom NAT. And we want to maybe say, I always want this web server to go out on a certain WAN IP that I have. Let's say 24.16.18.241. So what this would do is if my WAN interface is a block of 5 IPs, but my primary outbound interface is, let's say, 240, it would always send the traffic from my web server out of my network on 241. Now that may be important because I may have other things on the internet that are expecting to see traffic from my web server on 241 instead of 240. And this would be a good reason to use a NAT rule. We want to override the default outbound NAT and get something that's more specific here. So that's a good example of when we'd use a NAT rule. The bypass rules, those are just ways to bypass certain types of traffic that are trying to come into our network. Now, an important thing to note is that if you're trying to do quality of service on certain types of traffic, maybe voice or video, you need to bypass that traffic in order to be able to write quality of service rules against it. So you can see here, I've got a bypass rule already in here. It comes out of the box this way with the destination port of 5060. That's for SIP traffic. And you can also add other things in here as you get more specific rules in your own network. But bypass rules basically just bypass all of our security scans, our intrusion detection mechanisms. It's only for traffic that we would trust. This thing that I want to touch on real quick here is just the troubleshooting section. This was very helpful if you're trying to determine basically just is the router online or not. This connectivity test right here is really great. It's going to use DNS to look up a name. It's going to try to connect to that thing, and it's going to tell you whether or not it worked. You also have a ping test and a DNS test in here, connection test. There's even a download test that will give you different things you can try. This is a 5 meg test file here. Let's start that. You can see there it downloaded, and it will give you a little bit of stats here. 12.6 megabytes a second. We were able to download that in. So this is a neat way to have an on-box real-world test of your download speed. So these tools are really helpful when you're trying to determine, did that config change that I made just break everything? Yeah, it did. Let me go revert that. These are great tools to have. The other thing that I wanted to show you real quick is the sessions viewer. So we go to sessions. This is going to give us real-time view, again, of everything that's happening on our network right now. We can sort it by protocol. We can sort it by host name. Sort it by ports. Look at all that kind of stuff. We can also do a filter search in here. So I could look at like only my laptop. I happen to know that has chat in the name. And then maybe I could sort it by traffic type, TCP, and just look at specific traffic that are going on here. It's going to show me in here, if I look over here at the session detail, a lot of information about what's happening with NAT and all of that kind of stuff. There's also going to be a section in here, you can see it's grayed out right now because there isn't anything applied to this. But if I had traffic in here that was being acted upon by bandwidth control priorities or QoS priorities, you'd see the priority right here. Say medium, very high, something like that. So that's a good way to figure out whether or not something that you've written a rule against to operate on is actually working, or whether it's not working. We also have a list of devices over here. This is going to give us some information about the different devices on our network, including MAC addresses, which is sometimes very helpful. When the last time we saw them was. And then hosts. These are things on the internet by IP, also with MAC addresses that are inside our network. Can we get some stats over here? So these are lots of tools that we have inside the Untangle to help us both get things set up and then also make sure that they're working. So make sure that you take advantage of these tools. Hope you enjoyed this video.